Kentucky, early spring, 1990. A broad north-facing slope, high up on the mountain, still holding patches of old snow in the shaded folds, while the valley below had already gone green. Nobody built an orchard on ground like that. Every grower in the county knew the rule. You wanted a warm southern exposure, early sun, early bloom, an early jump on the market before prices dropped. Elias Reed leased that cold north slope anyway. 60 acres in all, though only about 18 of them would ever hold trees, the rest left as buffer, access road, and standing timber. He signed a 20-year agricultural lease with a renewal option and the right to plant and improve the ground as his own, the kind of arrangement that gave an orchard time to actually become an orchard instead of getting pulled out from under him in a year or two. $1,100 a year for ground that had never grown anything but rough pasture grass and scrub timber. 4 years later, a clear, cold April night would wipe out most of the blossoms in the valley below, and Elias's trees, the ones everybody said were planted on the wrong side of the mountain, wouldn't even have opened yet. His neighbors thought he'd finally lost his mind. Elias was divorced, living alone in a small rented place near the base of the mountain, the kind of man who'd learned to trust his own eyes over other people's certainty a long time before this orchard ever came into it. He wasn't trying to prove anybody wrong. He was just following a pattern he'd watched for 2 decades and had never once seen anybody else write down. Elias was 46. 20 years on county road crews had put him out on mountain roads at every hour, in every season, watching things most people never noticed. He'd watched spring come to the valley too, sometimes 3 weeks before it reached the shaded north slopes above it. He'd watched buds swell early down low and stay tight and dormant up high, long after the valley trees had already gone to blossom, and more than once he'd watched a hard, unexpected frost drop down out of a clear April sky and burn every one of those early blossoms black in a single night, while the slower ground, the ground that hadn't opened yet, came through untouched. He carried that observation around in his notebook for years before he ever acted on it. The idea was simple, and strange enough that nobody else in the county had tried it. If early bloom was a gamble against frost, then late bloom might be the safer bet, not every year, but often enough, in the years that mattered. He chose apples, a hardy late-blooming variety suited to cold ground, the kind of tree that could take a rough mountain slope and a short growing season without complaint, provided a man was patient enough to let it work on its own schedule. 1,200 trees, planted over 3 seasons across those 18 workable acres, climbing the north face of the mountain in long rows, Elias laid out himself with his surveyor's level, following the contour instead of fighting it. His neighbor down the road, a long-time orchard man named Harlan Pruitt, drove up one afternoon to see what all the digging was about. Harlan wasn't unkind about it. He just laid it out plain, the way a man explains something he's certain of. Elias would bloom late. He'd ripen late. He'd miss the early market when prices ran highest, and he'd be racing the first frost of fall just to get a late crop in before the cold shut him down completely. Elias didn't argue. He just said he'd rather race the first frost of fall than the last frost of spring, and let Harlan make of that what he would. For the first few years, Harlan looked like the one who understood orchards, and Elias looked like the one who'd made an expensive mistake. The young trees came into bearing slow, the way trees do on cold ground with a short season. Fruit set was uneven those first 2 years, heavier on some rows than others, and Elias found himself fighting problems he hadn't fully planned for. The cold slope held moisture longer after a rain than the valley orchards did, and that extra dampness brought fungal pressure he had to learn to manage, more careful pruning to open the trees up to air, wider spacing than he'd first planned, a fungicide schedule adjusted to a slope that dried out slower than anywhere else he'd farmed. Some rows never did well at all, planted a touch too low where cold air pooled worse than he'd mapped, and Elias pulled those trees out and replanted with a hardier rootstock 2 years in, eating the cost without much complaint. He kept a running tally of every dollar that went into the ground: lease payments, tree stock, spray, the replanted rows, and by the end of year 2 he'd sunk close to $19,000 into 60 acres that still hadn't produced a full crop. His savings from 20 years of road work covered most of it. But the margin was thin enough that a third bad year would have forced him to walk away. His first real harvest, when it finally came, reached the packing house a full 2 weeks behind Harlan's crop and every other orchard in the valley. By then, the early market had already been picked over. Elias sold his fruit at an average price, nothing special, barely enough that year to cover the lease and the spray costs, let alone pay himself anything for the labor. He sat in his truck outside the co-op afterward, engine off, doing the math on the back of the settlement slip, working out how many more seasons like that one his savings could actually absorb. The number he came up with was 1. Harlan wasn't gloating about it. He just nodded when he saw Elias at the co-op, the way a man nods when a thing has gone the way he expected it to. Elias kept working road crew shifts through those lean years, same as he always had, the steady paycheck covering what the orchard couldn't yet, and he kept filling that notebook. Every spring he walked both slopes, his own, and a section of Harlan's Valley Orchard. Harlan let him track out of curiosity more than anything, recording bud break dates, first bloom, full bloom, side by side, year after year. The valley trees broke dormancy anywhere from 12 to 21 days ahead of his, depending on the year. His own trees, season after season, stayed locked down tight until the risk of a hard frost had mostly passed. It wasn't a guess anymore. It was 4 years of dated entries in his own hand, proving the pattern held. He started keeping a small battery weather radio on the kitchen windowsill every March the way he used to keep one in the road crew truck, listening close on any night the forecast mentioned a clear sky and a calm wind, the exact combination that let cold air settle and hold instead of moving on through. He learned to trust that radio the way he'd learned to trust his own level. Then came the spring that changed everything. Late March turned unusually warm that year, temperatures running 8 to 10 degrees above normal for nearly 3 straight weeks. Down in the valley, orchards bloomed almost 2 weeks earlier than average, and growers were glad of it, expecting an early crop and an early payday. Harlan's trees were in full white bloom by the second week of April. Up on Elias's slope, the buds had barely begun to swell. On the night of April the 18th, the sky cleared hard and the wind dropped to nothing, the kind of still, clear night every orchard man in the county dreads. Temperatures fell to 26 degrees and held there for nearly 5 hours before dawn. Down in the valley, growers were out all night burning smudge pots and running wind machines, doing everything they could to keep the air moving over blossoms that were already wide open and defenseless. It wasn't enough. Elias stood out on his own porch that night, watching the orange glow of smudge pots flickering down in the valley, smoke drifting low across Harlan's orchard in the still air, men out working through the dark to save blossoms that were already too far along to save. Up on his own slope there was nothing to protect, no smoke, no fires, no wind machines running, just quiet, dormant trees, waiting on ground that hadn't caught up to spring yet. Harlan lost close to 80% of his blossoms that night, and with them, most of his crop for the year. Other valley orchards reported losses nearly as bad, some worse, entire blocks of trees left with nothing to show for a warm, promising spring. Up on Elias's slope, most of the buds were still tight and closed when that cold settled in. He lost some fruit too. The earliest few rows on his warmest ground had started to open, and frost took a real bite out of those. But across the bulk of the 1,200 trees, the buds simply hadn't opened enough to be vulnerable yet. When the danger passed and bloom finally came on his slope 2 weeks later, it came on safe, into warmer, settled weather, with no more hard frost left in the season to threaten it. That fall, Elias brought in the fullest harvest the young orchard had ever produced, close to 1,100 bushels off 1,200 trees, still working their way toward full maturity, while orchards across the valley brought in a fraction of a normal crop. Regional supply collapsed hard enough that packing houses were paying nearly double the normal wholesale price just to have fruit to move, up from around $9 a bushel in a normal year to close to $17 that fall. Elias sold into that shortage with a harvest most of his neighbors simply didn't have, and for the first time since he'd signed that lease, the orchard cleared a real profit, enough to pay off what remained of his early establishment costs in a single season. It wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't the only orchard left standing for 100 miles. A couple of higher, colder pockets elsewhere in the county had come through with partial crops of their own. But locally, among growers who supplied the same packing houses and the same regional buyers, Elias was one of the only ones with real commercial volume that year, and the only one whose whole strategy had been built around exactly that kind of spring. Harlan Pruitt drove up not long after harvest, same road, same truck, a very different look on his face than the one he'd worn, watching Elias plant those trees years before. He walked the rows slow, asking real questions this time: which cultivar, what elevation, how the slope faced, when bud break usually ran compared to his own ground. He wasn't looking for an excuse. He wanted to understand what Elias had actually built. Elias showed him the notebook, 4 years of dates lined up next to each other, valley against slope, plain as anything. It wasn't luck, he said. It was just paying attention to which mornings the frost came, and which ground stayed asleep long enough to miss it. Elias didn't let the story end with one lucky frost, though, because he knew a business built only on disaster years wasn't a business at all. In the seasons after that, he leaned into the second advantage his late bloom gave him, a harvest window that opened 2 to 3 weeks after the valley orchards had already sold through and gone quiet. He struck a standing arrangement with a regional produce distributor who was glad to have fresh Kentucky apples still coming in after every other local grower had finished for the season, filling a gap in the market instead of competing head-on for the same early customers Harlan and the rest were already chasing. In an ordinary year, with no frost disaster anywhere in the valley, that late window alone was enough to keep the orchard solidly profitable. Early season apples usually got the highest headline price, but that price fell fast once. Every valley orchard was picking at once, and the packing houses were flooded with fruit. By the time Elias's crop came in, 2 to 3 weeks after the glut, packing houses paid a steady premium over that same glut week price, just to have fresh local apples still coming in when everyone else's bins had gone quiet. It wasn't the frost year windfall, it was something better for a business. The same solid number, season after season, whether the spring had been kind to the valley or not. Within 2 seasons, the distributor's standing order alone accounted for close to 60% of Elias's crop. The frost year had proven the concept. The years after it proved the business could stand on its own 2 feet without needing another disaster to make it work. Word of what had happened on Elias's slope spread slow through the county, the way real proof usually does, mostly by other growers driving up to see it for themselves. A few, cautiously, began setting aside small blocks of their own coldest, least favored ground, land they'd always written off as too slow, too shaded, too far from the sun everyone else was chasing. Elias walked a few of those hillsides himself, level in hand, same as he always had, helping other men learn to read the thing he'd spent 20 years learning on county roads before he ever planted a tree. Years later, driving the ridge road above the valley, a man could look down and see new orchard blocks, climbing slopes that had sat empty for a generation, planted on ground everybody used to call the wrong side of the mountain. Everybody wanted fruit 2 weeks early. Elias built his farm around being 2 weeks late.